A closed-door congressional deposition, a leaked photograph, a former Secretary of State demanding cameras. Today was one of those days where the circus and the substance happened in the same room at the same time. I'm Zuri.
And I'm Alistair. We've also got a genuine breakthrough in nuclear talks with Iran, a judgment that could kill Greenpeace, and a shootout off the coast of Cuba that sounds like something out of a Cold War thriller. Let's get into it.
So Hillary Clinton sat for a deposition today before the House Oversight Committee as part of the congressional investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. This was in Chappaqua, New York, closed to the press, being recorded on video. Her opening statement went right at the committee. She said she has no information about Epstein's crimes, can't recall meeting him, and accused Republicans of using her as a political distraction from President Trump's own ties to Epstein.
Wait, she says she never even met Epstein? That's a bold statement considering 3 million pages of files have been released.
That's what she testified. But here's where the day went completely sideways. While Clinton was testifying behind closed doors, Republican Representative Lauren Boebert of Colorado took a photograph of the proceedings and sent it to Benny Johnson, a conservative influencer and YouTuber. Johnson posted it on X immediately. This is a closed-door deposition. Committee rules explicitly prohibit outside press or photographers from documenting the proceedings.
And when reporters asked Boebert why she did it, her response was just, "Why not?" She actually said that. She also mentioned she liked Clinton's blue suit and wanted everyone to see it.
Clinton's legal team immediately paused the deposition. They were furious. Her lawyers argued this was a violation of chamber rules and an attempt to turn a serious legal proceeding into a social media spectacle. Then Clinton made a move that caught everyone off guard. She demanded the entire deposition be made public. She said if pieces are going to leak out of context, just put the cameras in the room and let people see the whole thing.
That's actually a pretty strong counterpunch. If your opponent is leaking unflattering bits, demanding full transparency removes their leverage.
Meanwhile, Democrats on the committee made a separate argument that's potentially more significant. They said that since former President Bill Clinton has already appeared for a deposition, that sets a precedent. Their position is, if one former president's spouse testifies about Epstein, why shouldn't the current president? Trump's name appears in FBI summaries, in flight logs, in documents. Democrats want the same standard applied.
That feels like the bigger story underneath the photo drama. The question of whether this committee is pursuing everyone equally or just the politically convenient targets.
Exactly. Committee Chairman James Comer had previously said lawmakers may question Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick about his Epstein ties too, after the files showed Lutnick arranged an island visit despite claiming he cut ties years earlier. But so far, the only depositions happening are Clinton's. The deposition eventually resumed and was still ongoing as of this evening. Comer says the full video will be released after Clinton's attorneys have a chance to review it, so we'll all see it eventually. But the optics of the day, the leak, the defiance, the demand for transparency, that's what everyone will remember.
Now let's pivot to something that could actually prevent a war. Because while Washington was consumed by the Epstein spectacle, something genuinely significant was happening in Geneva.
The United States and Iran held indirect nuclear talks in Geneva today, mediated by Oman, and for the first time in what feels like years, the word coming out of the room was progress. Omani Foreign Minister Saeed Badr al-Busaidi said the two sides made significant progress and exchanged creative and positive ideas. He said they'll meet again within a week, with technical-level discussions in Vienna.
Who was actually in the room?
Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was there, along with US envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. It was indirect. They weren't sitting across the table from each other. The Omanis shuttled between them. Araghchi told Iranian state TV they reached agreement on some issues but still have differences on others. Iran, according to 4 officials who spoke to the New York Times, is reportedly offering to suspend nuclear enrichment for 3 to 5 years, dilute its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, and cap enrichment at 1.5% for medical research.
That's a major concession from Iran. What does Washington want?
Everything. Witkoff told AIPAC donors yesterday that the US demands any deal have no sunset clause, meaning Iran would have to agree to restrictions permanently. Quote, You have to behave for the rest of your lives. The Trump administration also insists that Iran's ballistic missile program and its support for armed groups in the region have to be part of the deal. Iran says separate the nuclear and non-nuclear issues, or there's no framework.
And all of this is happening while the U.S. has aircraft carrier strike groups in the region, and Trump has essentially given Iran a countdown to make a deal or face strikes.
Right. And there's an even more aggressive piece to this. Politico reported today that Trump's senior advisors would prefer Israel to strike Iran first. The thinking is that an Israeli attack would trigger Iranian retaliation, which would then generate public support for US strikes. One source close to the White House said the internal view is, quote, "We're going to bomb them because a real deal seems unlikely." The Treasury also imposed new sanctions today on more than 30 individuals, entities, and shadow fleet vessels tied to Iran's oil sales and missile production.
So the U.S. is negotiating with one hand and loading weapons with the other. That's the tension.
It's classic coercive diplomacy. The question is whether the pressure produces a deal or produces a war. Today's talks were genuinely the most promising in months, but whether it holds when both sides go back to their capitals, that's a different question entirely. All right, let's shift gears entirely, because a judge in North Dakota just signed what might be a death warrant, not for a person, but for one of the most iconic environmental organizations on the planet.
You're talking about Greenpeace.
Judge James Guion said this week he will order Greenpeace to pay $345 million in damages to Energy Transfer, the company behind the Dakota Access Oil Pipeline. This stems from the 2016 and 2017 protests at Standing Rock, when thousands of people camped near the pipeline's Missouri River crossing upstream from the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation.
$345 million. And Greenpeace USA has, what, $23 million in total assets?
$1.4 million in cash, $23 million in total assets. They cannot pay this. A jury last year found Greenpeace USA liable on all counts: conspiracy, trespass, nuisance, defamation, and tortious interference. The jury originally awarded $667 million. The judge cut it roughly in half to $345. Greenpeace says they plan to appeal to the North Dakota Supreme Court, but the original jury award was already devastating. Energy Transfer, for their part, is also appealing. They want the full $667 million restored.
This feels like it has implications way beyond Greenpeace. If a pipeline company can win a $300 million judgment against a nonprofit for supporting protests, what does that mean for environmental activism in general?
That's exactly the argument Greenpeace is making. They say this lawsuit was designed to use the courts to silence critics and chill First Amendment rights. Energy Transfer says this isn't about free speech. It's about Greenpeace allegedly orchestrating illegal activity, including organizing trespass, sending blockade supplies, and making false statements about the project. Where you come down on that probably depends on how you see the balance between corporate accountability and the right to protest. But the practical reality is this. If the judgment stands, Greenpeace USA may cease to exist.
All right, our last story today involves a shootout that happened just 90 miles from Florida. And it's wild.
Cuban forces killed 4 people and wounded 6 others after a Florida-registered speedboat entered Cuban territorial waters on Wednesday. Cuba's Interior Ministry says the group was made up of anti-government Cuban exiles, dressed in camouflage, carrying assault rifles, handguns, homemade explosives, ballistic vests, and telescopic sights. Cuba is calling it a foiled armed infiltration attempt.
So 10 people on a speedboat from Florida armed to the teeth tried to infiltrate Cuba?
That's what Cuba says. They identified the 6 survivors, 2 of whom were apparently already wanted in Cuba for planning previous attacks. Cuba says its patrol was fired upon first, and a Cuban officer was wounded. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was in St. Kitts at the time, said this was not a US operation and no US government personnel were involved. But he also said the US won't just take Cuba's word for it. Quote, "We're going to know the full story of what happened here." Florida's Attorney General opened his own investigation.
This is almost exactly 30 years to the day since the Brothers to the Rescue incident, when Cuban jets shot down 2 small planes from a Cuban exile group.
February 1996. 4 people killed. That event destroyed a diplomatic thaw between the US and Cuba and led directly to the Helms-Burton Act tightening sanctions. The timing here is eerie. US-Cuba tensions are already at their highest point in years. Cuba's fuel crisis has grounded all flights at its airports. 2 Helms-Burton cases are currently before the US Supreme Court. And now an armed incursion from a Florida boat, regardless of who organized it, gives both governments a new flashpoint to navigate.
It's one of those days where everything seems to be happening at once. The Epstein circus in New York, nuclear brinkmanship in Geneva, a potential death blow to Greenpeace in North Dakota, and a shootout off Cuba's coast.
And if there's a thread connecting all of it, it's this. In every one of these stories, the gap between what's happening and what it looks like is enormous. Clinton's deposition is about substance, but the photo leak turned it into theatre. The Iran talks are genuinely promising, but both sides are still preparing for war. Greenpeace is fighting for its existence, but the legal question is really about whether protest itself can survive corporate litigation. And in Cuba, 10 people on a speedboat may have just created a diplomatic crisis that neither country wanted. The facts matter, but the way they're framed, that's what drives what happens next. I'm Zuri.
And I'm Alistair. We'll see you tomorrow.